Hey everyone. So what do we want to start off with a revolution unit is looking at um, basically how the American Revolution came about. What were the long-term causes that brought around the revolt of the colonists against their mother country, against Great Britain, and what were the deep-seated issues, the long-term issues that caused this situation where, like I said, why can't we be friends? So the idea of the American Revolution and the idea of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in July 1776 is so ingrained in us as Americans. We celebrate the 4th of July, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, as a national holiday. We celebrate fireworks and patriotism. Um, so we see these things from a young age. We're very aware at this young age that we did secede from Great Britain. But what we fail to realize a lot of times is that the men who signed the Declaration of Independence and these colonists who signed it were declaring treason against Great Britain. These men, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, they were leaving the life they had behind and declaring themselves traitors against it. And so that's what Franklin's quote here is basically saying, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we will hang separately. So what he's saying, they have to all work together and secede from Great Britain together, but they're facing the idea that they could die of treason. They could die, they could be put to death for being traitors if they're caught, if they fail. So this is a huge decision. This is a huge aspirations they have. So what we really need to decide, and what we really need to dig into here, is why men like Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Hancock would be willing to do this. Jefferson was a very wealthy man before signing the Declaration of Independence. He owned 187 slaves. That put him in the top 1% of plantation owners in Virginia. He owned 13,700 acres of land outside of what's Charlottesville today. So this is a huge plot of land, a huge plantation. He was very well liked within the colony of Virginia. He frequently served in the House of Burgesses, and he was very wealthy, very well off. So why would he be willing to risk all this to declare his independence? So what eventually happens to Jefferson in 1781? He has to flee Monticello because a faction of redcoats, British soldiers, showed up at his property to arrest him, and he had to flee at night to get away from that. He had to flee everything he owned by declaring independence later on. So you see, this is a very risky proposition. This is very difficult for these men, and so we have to kind of dig into why they'd be willing to do that. You can also look at why would men like George Washington be willing to go all in. So what you see here is the famous picture of George Washington's troops crossing the Delaware River to attack Hessian mercenaries, German mercenaries who worked for the British in Trenton, New Jersey. At this point of the war, the cause of the colonial militias was really in trouble. There were huge desertion rates, they were low on supplies, and most of Washington's advisors were recommending that he surrender. But he did not. He went and did a daring assault on Trenton and won. So why is he willing to risk this? The British at this point probably would have offered kindly terms to a lot of men like George Washington in return for this, but they were willing to risk it all. So what really caused them to do this? So what really caused the war? I'm sure we've probably heard these 2 points before in the past. The idea of taxation without representation. We've probably all heard this term before. This is the idea that the British were unfairly taxing the Americans, taxing the colonists without giving them any form of representation in the parliament. While this is true, the Americans were actually taxed far less than British citizens were, British subjects at this point were, and it's not the main cause. Also, we've probably heard the story of the shot heard around the world at the skirmish at Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775. And while this did help kickstart the war, the fighting, it wasn't the underlying reason why the colonies revolted, why the colonies went against the British. There were a lot of other factors contributing to this. These were just small aspects, and what we're looking at is the deeper causes. So if we're really to sum up what the overall cause of the revolution is, it's simply that the Americans and the British had a different view of what their relationship was. The Americans viewed themselves quite differently than the British viewed Americans, and the Americans viewed the British quite differently than they probably viewed themselves. So they really had a miscommunication, really that understood what the idea of their relationship was. So the British view would have been one of like a top-down view of what you see there, like a parent and a child. The Britain is a colony. That's a colony. The Americas are a colony of Britain. We send stuff to them. They we protect them. We manage the Americans, and the Americans obey. They send stuff back to us. They send their goods back to us. So it's really a top-down. The British Parliament controls them. That's how they see the Americans. So what you're really seeing here is the idea of mercantilism in full effect. So the idea is the colonies created to help the British Empire become economically self-sufficient. So Britain's a smaller island. They're not producing the raw materials that they can in the Americas. So what they're getting is raw materials. From the materials as cash crops and other things are coming to Great Britain. They're producing manufactured goods. This is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. And these manufacturing goods are going to Africa, to other parts of Europe, and to the Americas. And then, of course, you've got the triangle trade with the slave trade, the Middle Passage coming to the Americas. So what you really have is you see that the British want to maintain this structure. They want to have colonies that send goods to the mother country to make that country rich. Of course, this is going to upset the colonies. So the American view of their relationship was actually quite different. The Americans, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, saw themselves as equal with those British nobles. They saw the amount of money they were making, as we talked about in the maturation thing. They saw themselves as richer. They were even taller, but they saw them equal. They said that we actually are going to help you. We'll send raw materials. You send manufactured goods. You respect us. We'll respect you. But neither side tells the other what to do. So as Britain starts to enforce these things, such as the Stamp Act, these are going to upset Americans because they're seeing the British basically looking at them as less. So why do the Americans feel equal to the British? Where do these feelings come from? Well, in a lot of ways, America had been independent since the 1600s, since the original founding of the Jamestown colony and the original British colonies. They were so far away that Americans were used to having that freedom. We talked about the idea of salutary neglect. The Americans a lot of times were allowed to have their own institutions as long as they worked with the British. And the British protected them some. The British Navy could protect them, but also it's so far away. It's 3,000 miles away. This isn't modern day where you can jump on an airplane and fly in hours. It takes months to get across the Atlantic. So it's going to take a long time for ships and for even ideas like there's no telephone lines. There's nothing like that. So even like a letter coming across the ocean is going to take a long time. So they were used to being far away, used to having their own way of life. So the view would come different. They were used to that freedom. So part of the political freedom also in the United States is they were allowed to have their own institutions, but also these institutions involved other ethnic groups that were not English. And so a lot of times these groups would not have the same connection to, the British Parliament or to the English institutions that, Englishmen might have, English colonists might have. So as we've learned about, half of Americans were not English. They were Dutch, Germans, Scots, Irish, and these people had been allowed to be part of these governments, to participate. And so what you see is they have an idea of political freedom that's different than some of the English colonists, but also an idea that's going to spread through the colonies. There's also a sense of religious freedom in the colonies as compared to Britain. Great Britain has a state church, the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And so that's the official church of the Virginia colony. But as we saw throughout the colonies, that's very different in a lot of the colonies. And these colonies, these religious groups are involved in politics, are involved in the ideas of making their own state. So these groups like the Quakers, the Huguenots, the Presbyterians, Jews, Catholics, and Puritans weren't members of the Church of England, so they wouldn't have that connection to Great Britain, to their religious ideas. And they would also have the idea that they want to practice their religion that they want to. Of course, we've learned too, the idea of economic freedom, of economic opportunity was maybe the biggest draw for the colonies. People came here for money, as we've talked about. They became here for the idea of free enterprise, that they could come here and make money for themselves, build a life for themselves. The beginning of that American dream, as we talked about, they could be artisans, have their own business, they could farm, have their own farms, and make their own way of life. So the idea of having that economic freedom. But then when the idea of mercantilism comes in, where you're sending goods back to the mother country, you're primarily selling. You're supposed to sell everything back to Britain. You're not making that life for yourselves. You see this as a form of oppression. So this is another driver in the drive towards independence. But also, a lot of the colonists were being heavily influenced by ideas that were happening with intellectual movements within Europe. The Enlightenment was happening. The Enlightenment is what's known as a birth of science and thought in Europe, in Western Europe. And a lot of these ideas had to do with politics. So what you see there is John Locke. John Locke was a English philosopher who heavily influenced the founding fathers. Locke believed in the idea of natural rights. We talked a little bit about that in the colonial maturation, but the natural rights is that the idea that you are given certain inalienable rights, so to say, certain rights, human rights are given to you from your creator that no one can take away from you. No government or anything can take away those rights as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They also believe in Locke's idea of the consent of the government. That's a condition urged by many as a requirement for legitimate government that basically the authority of the government should depend on the consent of the people as expressed in votes and elections. So that's not happening in a monarchy. So what basically that means is that the people are giving the authority to the government, not the other way around. The government isn't enforcing its authority on the people. They also believed in Locke's idea of ordered liberty as that as long as there is order in society, that most people should be given as much liberty as possible, that the government should have as little control over your life as possible. They also, the ideas, as we saw, is separation of church and state, that they should be separate organizations. The church should not control functions of the government, as was seen throughout Europe at this time. And also, finally, the idea of separation of powers. That is, you have separate branches of government, separate power structures within a government. So one form cannot rule over everybody. It's an idea that helps you go against majority rule and against authoritarian government. So these enlightened ideas were really becoming influential in the colonies, especially amongst the wealthy people, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, those. So they will have heavy influence going forward. So, kind of the big idea is both sides were not aware of their different attitudes. And as I say, we are not the same. It's a big shocker. So it's kind of like they didn't see the shark coming up behind them. The British weren't aware of it, and also the Americans didn't see their relationship like that. They view themselves as equal. So there's different attitudes about what's happening. So this is going to create a situation that will lead to revolution. So the first wake-up call of the idea that there are differences between the Americans and the British is during the war that's known as the French and Indian War. And this is actually known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, but when it was fought in the colonies, it was called the French and Indian War. This war started in 1754, and it pitted the French forces who allied with several Indian tribes against the colonies of British America, so against British colonies. So what happens here is that so it starts in 1754 and lasts till 1763, and it really shows some of the divides in values, some of the divides between what the colonists think of themselves and what the British think the colonists should think. So you really start to see some fractures with this war. So the idea that this would create a rift between the British and the Americans is actually pretty unexpected because the Americans were allied with the British against the French in the French and Indian War. So what happens is France and Britain have kind of been constantly at war back and forth for a long time. This will continue to go on into the 19th century. But what happens in the Americas is this has to do with conflicting land claims, and this is how it gets started over here. In the colonies is that so the British claim the colonies, the 13 colonies from Georgia to Massachusetts. The French claim control of Canada and the Western Territories, pretty much the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River and on. And these are both empires at this point. They're competing globally now for colonies and for land claims. So they're fighting against each other in Europe, and now it will spread to the Americas. So what happens actually? George Washington helps ignite this war. George Washington is a colonel in the British military at this point, and there's some conflicting claims around the area of Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania on the Ohio River. The French claim certain territories, the British claim others, and Washington actually led one of the first attacks, the first attack actually, on the French and their allies, their Indian allies on the Ohio River near Pittsburgh, and this kind of sparked the war in the colonies in 1754. So the French and Indian War and the Seven Years' War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. uh, this war ended as Great Britain being the victor. And as you can see in this map, basically what happens in the Americas is France lost Canada and the region west of the Appalachian Mountains to Great Britain. The British colonies now expand. The British control expands into Canada and then all the way to the Mississippi River. You see there, that's a huge plot of land now. And so you see Spain actually controls the territory west of the Mississippi, but Britain gains a lot of land, and what happens is this unexpectedly changes the relationship between Britain and the colonies. So this war actually had huge effects on Britain. Britain built up a huge debt from this war. They ended up with a debt of 140 million pounds, would be tens of trillions of dollars in today's money. So from the debt from this war, they need to raise revenue throughout their empire. So they need to tax their citizens throughout the empire. And of course, their citizens and subjects are also in the colonies. They also see their relationship with the colonies as they sent troops to defend the colonies. They fought in the colonies. So the colonies should take some responsibility and should have to pay taxes to pay off this war debt. But what also happens is they end the idea of salutary neglect, which we've talked about, and they really start enforcing the idea that Parliament is now going to make taxation decisions throughout the entire British Empire. So they're going to start telling the Americas what to do through the Parliament back in London, and also taxing them from decisions made back in London. So that's where you get the idea of taxation without representation. But the war actually affected the colonies very differently than it did the British. The Americans actually felt more secure now on the continent without the French there, without the antagonism of the French. The French have been moved away. So to the west of the Appalachian, they're no longer French colonies. North to Canada, they're no longer French colonies. They don't have to worry about the French anymore, the having conflicts with them. So they didn't feel like they needed the help of the British military power, the British Navy and the British Army to help them as much. And so what they see is the idea that they now need a looser relationship, not a tighter relationship, not more control from Britain. They have more security than they've ever had. They need to be left alone even more. But so you see the conflicting ideas here. You see what's going to happen, and these ideas are going to boil over, and these things are certain aspects are going to come to head that will cause these men, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, to make that great sacrifice and to revolt from the British.